Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Here we are again, another version of Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. And we have with us today Adelle Purdham from Ontario, near the Peterborough, or in the Peterborough area. We're going to talk about her book, I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. But first, Adelle, again, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And let's get you to introduce yourself. Who are you?
Sure. I am the author of I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. I am a parent disability ally, and I am a sessional course instructor at Trent University in Peterborough, where I live, and I teach creative writing part-time.
Okay, so you're also an expert in the French language, of which I am not, to my eternal shame. How did you learn French so well that you can be an instructor in it?
Right. So I began my career as a French immersion teacher, and essentially I went to French immersion when I was a kid. And interestingly enough, so I have 3 daughters, and all 3 of my daughters go to French first language school now. I can tell you that story if you'd like, of how we kind of ended up there. But essentially I then, after I took French immersion, I went on to study French literature at university and then became a French teacher. But that really isn't what I do anymore at all. Well, teaching's part of who I am and continues to be part of my identity. But French, I really just get to scratch that itch to kind of focus on language learning through my children, really.
Oh, great. So French literature, does that include Quebec authors or the classics from the golden age of France?
Oh gosh, it was more the classics from like the Rabelais and all those guys from way back in the day. But I would have been really interested, actually, to read about Quebecois literature. I lived in Quebec for a stint. When I was in third year university, you could do a credit in Trois-Pistoles. And so I lived there for a summer and had a French boyfriend, really immersed myself in the culture. And so I wish I had been more into checking out the books while I was there as well.
Hey, baby, donnez-moi la bouche pour whatever.
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much. You Anglos with your tragically hip and all that stuff. But anyway,
that's right.
You have an MFA in Creative Nonfiction. What the heck is that?
Great question. An MFA is a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction. So I completed mine at the University of King's College, which is sort of Dalhousie's journalism and where they house their master's programs in the arts. And so I spent 2 years focusing on writing what would become my book, actually. There was sort of this component in learning about the craft of writing, and then this component of learning about the business of writing and the publishing world, which proved to be super helpful.
Right, I would imagine so. And an offshoot of that, what exactly is creative nonfiction?
Oh, I love that question. I've been very fortunate to teach a course in creative nonfiction a few times, and I think of it as true. Well, this isn't my definition, but there is the literary journal Creative Nonfiction. And I believe their tagline is something along the lines of true stories well told. And so I think of creative nonfiction that way, as having kind of those 2 components of storytelling and craft, right?
Yeah.
Like when we're thinking about a memoir, it isn't just someone's journal taken and transcribed. It is shaped into a story and crafted.
With emotions and conflicts and ups and downs and ins and outs and conversations, and not just like a newspaper story.
Yeah, this is it. Like creative nonfiction uses all the same literary devices as fiction, right? All the same elements sort of are also in creative nonfiction.
Okay, so moving along, we've got Adelle Purdham with I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself, which brings us to your family. And before we get there, I want you to tell me what the heck is spaghetti squash burrito bowls?
I love how you're pulling out these pieces out of my book. I really do appreciate that. You're a careful reader. So this is like a famous recipe in my family, and just that, my husband happened to be making that recipe for me when my third daughter was born. That's what we were having for dinner, and it interrupted the spaghetti squash burrito bowls. But essentially, you take a spaghetti squash, you bake it in the you bake them, cut it in half, bake them in the oven, hollow them out, and then there's like this red cabbage slaw that you make that involves like some spicy tomatillo salsa that you kind of mix in with the slaw, and then you scrape out the spaghetti squash once it's baked, mix it all together, and put it back inside the husk of the spaghetti squash, and it just makes a really delicious, healthy dinner.
Meanwhile, the other kids were having chicken fingers, right?
Oh yeah, there's zero chance they would have they would have eaten anything spicy.
There's zero chance I would either, because there's two things I don't eat. One is squash and the other is oysters. So.
Oh gosh. Fair.
Okay, so the family, you have 3 children. However, one in the middle is a bit different. How is that?
Yeah, so I have 3 girls. Ariel, who's 13, Elise, who's 12 and has Down syndrome, and Penelope, my youngest, who's 8. And there's 18 months between Ariel and Elise. So I sort of had this experience of having given birth to, what we would say maybe is a typically developing child. And I sort of expected that things would be the same with my second child when I was, pregnant. Ariel was only 9 months old.
Yep.
And I was 28 years old when I gave birth to Elise. So I think there's a lot of stereotypes around, who has a child with Down syndrome? What does it mean to be, quote unquote, a special needs mom? And so I really, in this book, want to push back against some of those stereotypes. And my book is, in fact, one of the first books that has come out of Canada that has been written about, not the entire book. I write about other facets of my life as well, but that really centers on my journey as a mother receiving a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome, but more so confronting my own ableism. This idea that an abled body is better after my daughter's birth.
And right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and just again, the definition, is there a standard definition of Down syndrome?
Absolutely. I think of Down syndrome, one way of talking about it is that it's an individual has extra genetic material, or, compared to the typically developing person. But I think of it as having 3 copies of the 21st chromosome is characterized as Down syndrome. And I love what the Canadian Down Syndrome Society says on their website. You can look it up if you're interested. The Down syndrome is a naturally occurring chromosomal arrangement, which means people with Down syndrome have always existed.
Right.
And Down syndrome is something for 98% of cases that just happens.
Yeah. You can't.
It's part of the human condition.
You didn't do anything wrong, quote unquote, to have this happen.
No, and I mean, but sometimes I do wonder, like, what did I do right?
Well.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what it means to have a child with Down syndrome in your life, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's it comes out of this idea that I write about in the book later on. I have a few essays that touch on our history of institutionalization of people with intellectual disability. And first, I think we're all a little bit afraid, and I can really speak for myself, afraid of things that we don't understand, right?
Right.
And so many years ago, like predominantly 50s, 60s, 70s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, people with intellectual disabilities, people with Down syndrome were placed in these large-scale institutions
Right.
that just became rife with violence, abuse,
Yeah.
and became places of dehumanization, right? Where people's needs were not met at all. But then that becomes society's perceptions or views of, like, that's why people with Down syndrome get treated the way that they do today, right? And why I consider that we live in this ableist society, where we don't value, we highly value intellect, which is fine, but then we don't necessarily value other things that are, I guess intellect is often tied in with money, right?
Yeah.
And so our ability to produce becomes productive in a capitalist society is super important. And so then we end up not really valuing maybe what's really important, which is like someone's capacity to give and receive love, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So again,
stop there.
not to be too blunt, but again, back to that earlier statement, did you ever think, oh, I have a Down syndrome, let's put it away? Like off to an institution and forget about it. You didn't think about that at all.
Yeah, so thankfully times have really changed, and that isn't the way that the medical establishment is directing parents, thankfully. Like, there are parents who have advocated hard, who came before me to kind of say, like, hey, wait a minute, this isn't what's best for families, this isn't what's best for people with Down syndrome, like, let's put an end to this, right? An amazing book, if anyone's interested in this topic further, was written by Dr. Catherine McKersher, Shut Away When Down Syndrome Was a Life Sentence. And it's about her younger brother. Catherine grows up to become a professor and a journalist, and she writes this journalistic account and heavily researched account of institutionalization in Ontario, and intertwined with the personal story of her brother who had Down syndrome and was removed from their family and put in an institution.
Right.
And that book just moved me so deeply, but it was also like being punched in the gut. Oh. Right? Like, it was, it was a visceral, like, I had just had my first daughter, right? So then picture I'm pregnant again, and this baby inside me, she feels the same. Like, I love her. I already love this baby that's inside me. And so what I did have to contend with, and what does still need to change, was, okay, like, when you have a baby with Down syndrome, they're born the way that they're born, right? And they're healthy the way that they're born, typically. But there are medical conditions associated with Down syndrome, but Down syndrome in and of itself is not a medical condition. And so I take issue with this idea that when you get a diagnosis of Down syndrome prenatally, like we did, then we were offered an abortion. And I just think, can you imagine? Like, no, we wouldn't consider that. My husband and I had that conversation, and I'm pro a woman having total autonomy over her own body and those decisions. But for me, I can't. Like, can you imagine if you're carrying a typical developing child? Parents would freak out if a doctor asked them that. Oh, and by the way, would you like an abortion with that? It's like, so I don't, for me, that needs to change. That piece of offering that piece of information, or that asking that question, is very pointed when a parent is in a vulnerable state, right? Or for me, it was a vulnerable state. I can't speak for someone else. And it just was about, first of all, me being okay with someone else having a child with Down syndrome, but not me.
But not you.
Right? That was the mindset I used to have.
Yeah.
That's very ableist, like very superior, right?
Yeah.
And so this whole process and my whole book is about me figuring out and kind of learning of, like, okay, I've got 2 feet on the ground, and now I'm standing and looking around at the people standing next to me. right? That's been the experience for me of disability parenting. And I can't, so that's where I start talking about, not without trying to sound corny or cheesy or anything, but how this experience has been a gift and enriched my life, right? Being able to see people more fully for their humanity. Right. Not just my daughter, but I think others as well. Of course, others with Down syndrome, but even just people that maybe have difference before that I wouldn't have been able to empathize with as deeply as I can now.
So it makes you kind of step outside yourself and say, hey, wait a minute, why am I thinking such a thing? And I've got this other person in front of me who's has qualities that maybe I wish I had, but they were born with a label, so, I should be afraid or should be worried or something. Ooh. So what is... first of all, about Down syndrome, you explained in the book where the name came from. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. John Langdon Down was the original physician who sort of characterized and discovered, if you will, that there was a collection of traits that are associated with people with Down syndrome. And so that's why Down syndrome is named after him, essentially.
And there must be an official medical name for it, but...
Trisomy 21. Trisomy as in 3.
Oh, 3.
And 21, 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. Okay. And that's also why World Down Syndrome Day, recognized by the United Nations, is celebrated on March 21st, coming up. Right. So March, the 3rd month, 21, 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. Cool, eh?
Right. So just to be, flippant here, that's sort of like 420.
There we go. A little bit different vibe,
but okay. So what is ableism then? Do we all kind of carry around a bit of that, do you think?
I do. I think it's pervasive in our society. Because if we didn't live in to me, ableism is this belief that an abled body is better than a disabled body. Right?
Right.
And so the book is about me confronting my own ableism. I think, and just through showing my life with my daughter, Elise, right? My life with my daughter with Down syndrome and how I now view things differently. But if we weren't an ableist society, then we would have concepts like universal design that are enacted in society. So the idea of universal design is that when we do something setting up spaces in such a way that it's accessible to everyone. So, for example, universal design would be a ramp. Why aren't houses designed with ramps? I don't, and I think because, a mother who has a baby with a stroller benefits, a person in a wheelchair benefits, an elderly person benefits, and everybody does. And so just I think there's a shift needs to happen where we start thinking more about everyone's needs versus some normal, quote unquote, person that doesn't actually really exist.
Right.
Everyone has their own needs and strengths and challenges as well, right?
Exactly. So the book is I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. Why that kind of title? Why that? Tell us about the title, I guess.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a big story behind the title. So so many stories. So when I was, maybe first I can tell you about And the Other Lies. So it was really important to me that while this story, the book, which is comprised of essays, that while the essays really touch primarily on me confronting my own ableism and my relationship with my daughter Elise, who has Down syndrome, I wanted this to be my story, right? I don't want to tell my daughter's story. I don't think that that's my job. I don't, morally, I wouldn't want to do that. I want to create space and allow space for her to tell her own story, in whatever way when she's ready. And so this is about, but I wanted there to be true representation of people with Down syndrome in my book, and those who mother them. And so, and the other lies, I am more than just a mother to a daughter with Down syndrome. And so I wanted to, if I'm to talk about my life as a mother to a child with Down syndrome, I wanted to incorporate other facets of my life that are really important to me in this effort to make myself seen. And also because, as I mentioned earlier, there weren't a lot of books, or hardly any books. There were no books 12 years ago, really, that were memoirs that I was looking for. And so I wanted to make myself seen and also make my daughter with Down syndrome seen in a way that was true, right? True stories well told, right? We come back to the creative nonfiction.
Right.
But the story of the title, this idea of I don't do disability. So when I was 16, I was this kid. I was a competitive gymnast, kind of an A student, driven, did all kinds of volunteer work. I knew pretty early on I wanted to be a teacher, and so I was getting a lot of experiences. I remember canvassing for the poor in the grocery store, collecting cans, raking leaves for the elderly in my neighborhood. And I would walk from my high school on my lunch break to my mom's elementary school, where she was a secretary, and coach the kids' gymnastics team. And on one of those days, I remember walking back and having this very distinct thought of, okay, Adelle, you're doing all of this volunteer work, but why aren't you volunteering with people with intellectual disabilities? And I sort of called myself out.
Really?
And I just remember this moment so clearly. And then I came to my own rescue. This is all happening in my head. And I came to my own rescue very quickly. And I said, that's okay. I just don't do disability. And it was like, I had this idea at the time that if I distanced myself and those that I loved from, I distanced myself from disability, that I could somehow avoid disability. But the thing is, that's really viewing disability, well, first as a negative, but also in kind of black and white constructs. Like, you're either disabled or you're not. And the truth of the matter is there's a lot of gray. There can be a lot of gray for disability, not for everyone, but, you can move in and out of disability. You can have a permanent disability or a temporary disability, right? Right. And also about, 20 to 25% of the world's population is considered disabled. And I also, so I kind of effectively dismissed that whole segment of the population. So I held that view, and then fast forward, 12 years later, and I give birth to a daughter with Down syndrome. And now that story just can't hold anymore. The stories I was telling myself about disability. I couldn't both love my daughter and be sad that she was here. So I chose love.
Good.
Right?
Good.
And learning.
Yep. And learning. So the book, I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself, it's by Adelle Purdham, and Adelle is with 2 L's, not one like the singer, but 2 L's. Remember that.
I came first.
Right. Exactly. What do you hope the book will do? In your wildest fantasy and dreams and expectations, what do you hope will happen with the book?
I want conversations just like this to happen, so that to get people thinking about disability. And I mean, I want there to be conversations. I want disability to become more of a national conversation than it is now. And I want for my daughter to be seen and valued for who she is, right? Ultimately. And her and all of her friends, right, with Down syndrome. I want there to help create a more inclusive society. If you're going to ask me to go big, that's the goal, right? And in sharing my very personal stories, it's this idea of come walk with me, come spend a day in my shoes. It isn't this idea of I'm going to tell you you're being ableist or anything like that. People don't listen or learn that way. And so I really wanted to create an emotional experience for the reader. And I hope that that emotional experience is something that they can take with them and then just be more mindful about people with Down syndrome in their lives and people that they encounter who may be quote unquote different.
Adelle, a couple more questions before we wrap it up. First, sort of on the more serious side, but not quite. Tell us about Jeremy's water bottle.
Oh, yeah, the story. So, yeah, part of, for me, of this journey to understanding my own ableism, and this is a reference that comes from my essay. I have an essay that's by the same title as the book. It's called I Don't Do Disability. And it's really my journey with ableism. And the story of Jeremy in the water bottle, when I was a young, I can't remember now even how old I was. I think I was in grade 5 or grade 6.
Grade 6.
But grade 6, okay. My friends thank you. My friends, I had just run this race. So again, I think I mentioned, competitive gymnast.
Yeah.
I was athletic when I was a kid, but I didn't know I could run. And so I had just finished this huge race and I won. I was so ecstatic. And my bestie friend hands me this water bottle and I'm chugging it, Jeremy's water bottle, but I didn't know it was Jeremy's water bottle. And Jeremy was a little boy with Down syndrome that I used to play with sometimes. But, when it was convenient for me, as kids do what they feel like, right? Yeah. But I so I'm just saying I wasn't, such a saint. But so I'm chugging his water bottle and then my friends are giggling and I'm sort of like, what? Like I kind of laugh at first too, like I'm in on the joke, and then I was like, oh no, I'm not. And then they, out with it, and they said, oh, that's Jeremy's water bottle. Oh. And my reaction was, I threw it to the ground in disgust. I wiped my lips. Like, to be honest, in fairness to me, I probably would have been grossed out if it was, anyone's random person's water bottle. Right. But I can be very honest and say, like, I thought it was my friend's water bottle. But I can be very honest and say, it was because he had Down syndrome.
Yep.
So, I was upset. I didn't want his cooties, right?
Exactly,
this idea that you can share his Down syndrome. Which, when I go into schools, exactly, which is hilarious. I've since heard South African Sherry Bernard, amazing woman with Down syndrome who became the first qualified teacher. I heard her speak at the World Down Syndrome Congress, and she said, when boys used to tease me, she's hilarious. She's like, I used to threaten to give them my Down syndrome. That shut them up. That shut them up. And I love that because it's the same idea. I mean, this is, going back almost 30 years ago. So times thankfully have changed because of, advocacy efforts, right? Right. But at the time, that's a story the story of Jeremy in the water bottle, thank you for bringing it up because it's one that I often share. I've done many speaking engagements in schools with my friend Emily, who has Down syndrome, and we're about the same age. And I mentioned I was a gymnast. Emily has competed for Team Canada in Special Olympics around the world in rhythmic gymnastics. So we were sort of like, we had a lot of things in common. And so we would go into schools together, and I'd often share that story of Jeremy. And I would say to the kids, what could I have done differently? And it is amazing to me. Kids are so smart. They're empathetic. They know what is the right thing to do. Right? Right. And so some of the answers I've gotten are, you could have found Jeremy, you could have gone and filled up his water bottle for him and given it back to him. I remember one student in grade 8 said to me once, you could find better friends. Like, these kids, they know what to do. They know what's right. But anyway, thank you for that.
Okay, and quickly before we go, Adelle, what is the best sandwich?
Oh gosh, any sandwich that I don't have to make. Something with grilled veggies or something, maybe a hot sandwich, something warm with melted cheese. Now, I've already eaten lunch, so I'm not getting hungry, but this all sounds so good.
Adelle Purdham, the author of I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. Your website, please.
If you go to adellepurdham.ca, you will find me. ADELLEPURDHAM .ca. I think I got that right.
Right.
Yes.
You
Okay,
got
perfect.
Okay. That's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
All right. And again, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.